I made myself water pools from which to water the growing trees of the grove. So he had an aqueduct system built. He figured all of this out. I acquired male and female servants and had servants or sons of my house born in my house. I had many, many servants, and they were having children. Yes, I had greater possessions of herds and flocks than all who were in Jerusalem before me. So he was wealthier than anybody else in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the special treasures of kings and of the provinces. He acquired lots of these things. I acquired male and female singers, the delights of the sons of men, and musical instruments of all kinds. The musical instruments is a Hebrew phrase which would be probably better to be rendered ladies or concubines. So he gathered all of these concubines, as we saw there in 1 Kings chapter 11. He had really about 1,000 women in his life. So I became great in verse 9. And I excelled or increased more than all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart rejoiced in all of my labor. Whatever I desired, whatever I saw, and I said, I want that. He said, I went ahead and I got it. There was no pleasure that he wanted that he didn't go after. And he was very involved in all that he was doing, and this was my reward from all my labor. That's all I got. I got what I wanted. Then I looked on all the works that my hands had done, and on the labor in which I had toiled. All of that work, all of that planting, all of that building, all of that managing of 1,000 wives, all of the logistics involved in his harem, in his kingdom, all of the hard work he was involved in, he says, indeed, all was vanity. It was all empty. I did everything I wanted to do, and after I had done it, it just was empty. It was grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun. And so again, speaking as a person who in his older years, he turned his heart away from God, and he experienced emptiness no matter what he did, where he went, what he gave himself to. He had all the money, he had all the wisdom, he had all the position, he had all the power. He could do anything he wanted to do. And he said, I did it all, and it was empty. And he talks then in chapter 2, beginning in verse 12, of the emptiness of materialism. Then I turned myself to consider wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man do who succeeds the king? I began to think, he said, about who's going to succeed me? Who's going to get everything that I've worked for? Only what he has already done. Then I saw that wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness. So he began now to make the observation that in his wisdom, he did see that it was better to be a wise person than it was to be a fool. Wisdom does excel folly, just like light is better than darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head. He's smart. But the fool walks in darkness. He's walking around as if he doesn't know where he's going. Yet I myself perceive that the same event happens to them all. So he said, it's better to be wise than it is to be foolish. But you know what? The same thing happens to the wise man as does the fool. A wise man can get sick, and so can a foolish man. A wise man can have an accident, can get in I was going to say a car wreck, but a donkey and cart wreck, just like a foolish man could get in a donkey and cart wreck. So having wisdom doesn't keep you from experiencing difficulties. It happens to foolish men, it happens to wise men. Verse 15, so I said in my heart, as it happens to the fool, it also happens to me. And why was I then the more wise? What good was all my wisdom? There's no difference. I was the smartest man around. And what happens to the fool happens to me. So while it's better to be wise than to be foolish, in another way, I can't avoid the problems that foolish men have. So what good is all of my wisdom? Verse 16, for there is no more remembrance of the wise than of the fool forever, since all that now is will be forgotten in the days to come. And how does a wise man die? As the fool. He realized that as time moved on, there was no more memory of a wise person than there was of a fool. It's just forgotten. I was speaking with someone this evening, an older person, and I was telling them, I said, one of the truths about people that live to be real old, let's say they live to be 100, not many people show up at their funeral. The reason why is they've all died. I got the same reaction from him as I'm getting from you. It wasn't really meant to be a joke. It was meant to be the expression of deep wisdom. But it's true. If you live that long, you've outlived all of your friends. The vast majority of them have already gone. People forget about you very quickly. Just after a short time, if you were the wisest man, they forget about you pretty soon. If you were a foolish man, they forget about you pretty soon. The wise man dies just like the fool dies. In verse 17, therefore, I hated life. He came to that place of just absolutely detesting being alive. I hated life because the work that was done under the sun was grievous to me, for all his vanity and grasping for the wind. He was just depressed over what he had found. There was just no meaning to anything. Then I hated all my labor in which I had toiled under the sun, because I must leave it to the man who will come after me. All my hard work. I've worked so hard to accomplish all these things, and guess what? I'm going to leave it to somebody, the person who's going to come after me. And in verse 19, and who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool? Yet he will rule over all my labor in which I toiled and in which I have shown myself wise under the sun. This is also vanity. So it was distressing to him to know, I've worked so hard. I'm not sure who's going to get everything I've worked for. It could be a foolish person. They're going to get everything that I've worked so hard to acquire. In verse 20, therefore I turned my heart and despaired of all the labor in which I had toiled under the sun. So he really became very, very despairing. He was very, very depressed. He felt ungratified. In verse 21, for there is a man whose labor is with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, yet he must leave his heritage or portion to a man who has not labored for it. This also is vanity and a great evil. I think there's a lot to be said for parents who, in their will, make sure that their children don't receive any of their wealth until they're a little wiser, a little older down the road. Their children won't like that, but if their children are going in the right direction, they'll understand the relationship between maturity, responsibility, etc. And so there's a lot to be said for that. So he was just saying there in the last part of verse 21, this also is vanity and a great evil. For what has man for all his labor? What do you get out of all your work? And for the striving of his heart with which he has toiled under the sun. What do you get out of all of your hard work, your whole life? You've worked so hard. For all his days are sorrowful. It's just an empty life. And his work was grievous. Even in the night, his heart takes no rest. So he couldn't even find rest at night when he was trying to unwind. And in the night watches, to wake up and to be discouraged, to be depressed, to be despairing. And so now he brings a little bit of a conclusion and a little bit of a more positive thought that he had come to, even in this position of having been turned away from the Lord. And so in the last portion of this chapter, he really speaks about just being content with the cards that God deals you. Just to be content with the providence of God. If this is what God has for you, he said, I found out that's a better attitude to have. There is nothing better for a man than that he should eat and drink, and that his soul should enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw was from the hand of God. So different than, of course, the Epicurean philosophy, the sensualist who would say, let us eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. What Solomon was advising, that a person's life ought to be regulated by the awareness ultimately of the coming judgment of God, and that there is a God. And so it's better if you at least recognize that, and that you can then be happy in the things that you do. And of course, we often hear people say, gosh, if you can find something you really like to do, boy, do that. If you can be happy in your job, that's a good deal. And so if a person can give themselves over to the gifts that they have, the personality that they have, their abilities, that's about the most you're going to get out of life, is just saying, well, this is who I am, this is what I've got, and God is there, and God has kind of established it that way. In verse 25, for who can eat or who can have enjoyment more than I? Which literally means without him. In other words, there is no enjoyment in life apart from God. He throws that in. So I've really understood that you can't really have a satisfying life if you live apart from God. Verse 26, for God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good in his sight, but to the sinner he gives the work of gathering and collecting, that he may give to him who is good before God. How true that is. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. And so now he begins to speak about God's design for life, how God gives life order. There's a certain order of the events in life, and he begins to describe life. He's pondering the